Hey YouTube, welcome back to my kitchen. My name's Morgan if you're new around here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make biscuits and gravy. I actually just found out today that I failed my glucose test, and so even though I know this is extremely high in carbs, I'm gonna go ahead and make it for dinner tonight. This is my last high carb meal for the next at least 13 weeks or until this baby comes. So I wanted to go ahead and use up the ingredients I'd already purchased and didn't want to waste those. So let's go ahead and get started with the biscuits part, and then while those are chilling in the fridge, I'll show you how to make the gravy. One thing I want to make note before we get started is I did put my butter in the freezer for the amount of time it takes me to get the dry ingredients mixed. I'm going to be using a box grater to grate the butter, which will save me a little bit of time mixing it all in with a pastry cutter, which is this nifty little tool here. If you don't have one of these, you can use a fork or you can use your fingers, but the important thing for flaky biscuits is to keep your dough cold, which is why I'm starting out with semi-frozen butter and I'm keeping my milk in the fridge until I absolutely need it. It's also why we're going to be chilling the dough before we actually cut out the biscuits and bake those. So let's go ahead and get started on what we need for the biscuits. If you're new to baking and you want to try to make some bread, I would highly recommend trying biscuits because it's really simple. There are hardly any ingredients. We're not working with any yeast and they turn out delicious. So what we're going to need for this recipe is a large mixing bowl, the pastry cutter, fork, or fingers, or whatever you're going to use to chop up your butter. You can also use a couple of knives. We need 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 tablespoon of baking powder. That's going to give us the rise in our biscuits along with the butter, and 1 teaspoon of salt. As I mentioned before, I put the butter in the fridge. We're going to need 6 tablespoons of grated butter. I'm going to use a box grater for that, or you can just cut it up with some knives if you don't have a box grater. And you want to make sure by the time you're done working with your dough that you've got pea-sized clumps of butter in your flour. And then we're also going to need about 3/4 of a cup of whole milk. You can also use buttermilk. That would give it a great flavor, or if you've got 2%, that would also work fine. Let's go ahead and get started on measuring out these dry ingredients. I want to give my butter as much time to chill in the freezer as I can, and I only put it in a few minutes ago. I know that when I'm grating the butter, it's going to warm, my hands are going to warm that up, so I want it as cold as possible. One thing I'm leaving out of these biscuits that is actually in the recipe is a tablespoon of sugar. I think that's purely for flavor. We're not working with any yeast that we need to feed or anything like that. So because this is already high carb and I'm trying to watch that, I'm gonna go ahead and leave all that out. I don't think it's necessary. Time to mix our dry ingredients really well. I'm gonna set our dry ingredients aside and get this stick of butter grated in my box grater. If you don't have this, you can just chop it up into cubes with a couple of knives and use your pastry cutter to cut that in, or like I mentioned before, you could use your fingers. One thing to be careful about when you're using your fingers is not to get the butter too warm. You still want clumps of butter, so it may take a little bit of extra time if you use the hand crumble method, because you may want to stick it in the fridge a couple of times just to make sure you're not melting your butter too much. On the other hand, you'll be saving yourself a couple of dishes, so it's really a trade-off and you can do whatever you find is easiest. Once we get the butter shredded, if you're going with this method, we're going to go ahead and start mixing it with the flour. It's a hot summer day in Texas, which is why I'm trying to avoid touching the mixture as much as I can. Obviously, there's going to be some times when you have to touch it, and I want to make sure that I'm getting the right consistency of butter in the flour. So I will kind of touch it a couple of times just to make sure it looks like kind of like wet sand, but I want to make sure I'm keeping everything as cold as possible. I also haven't preheated my oven yet for the same reason. So once we get everything mixed well, we are going to put this mixture in the fridge to let it chill until we're ready to shape the biscuits and start the gravy. If you're wondering why I'm being so insistent on keeping that butter cold, it's because during the baking process, when the butter melts, it's going to leave air pockets and 1, help the biscuits rise, and 2, make them super flaky. Some people might say I'm overworking my dough a little bit here, but I want to make sure everything is well combined. If you do overwork the dough, it can make the biscuits a little tough or make them not rise as well, but mine turned out fine, as you'll see in the end. Before we actually start the gravy, I'm going to make a few sausage patties. I don't want to use the entire package of breakfast sausage in the gravy, which you can actually totally leave out the sausage if you don't want sausage gravy, but I was trying to add a little bit of extra protein. But I've made it with the whole pound of sausage before, and you either have really sausagey gravy or you've got to make a ton of gravy, and I didn't really want that many leftovers of this because I can't eat it after today. So I am making some sausage patties to go along with our biscuits and sausage gravy. Those are my husband's hands, by the way, adding some extra black pepper. If you do make the patties, be a little bit more patient than I was and make sure to get a nice Maillard reaction. That's much better than the first patty I flipped. That'll add a nice depth of flavor and also a nice little crunch. Now that I've taken the patties off, it's finally time to start the gravy. You'll notice that I've crumbled up the rest of that breakfast sausage that I had in the pound. I didn't bother draining the fat between the patties and the sausage crumbles, but I did drain a little bit of the fat before I added the butter. Next, I'm basically going to try to make a roux with the sausage fat, butter, and flour to help thicken the mixture up a little bit later. And once I'm satisfied that the raw flour flavor has cooked out and has been well combined with the butter, I'm going to go ahead and add some heavy cream and milk. Since we did add the flour as a thickening agent, you can absolutely skip the heavy cream and just use milk, but I am a little bit limited on the amount of milk that I have. I still want to save some for my husband's coffee in the morning, so that's why I'm substituting with a little bit of heavy cream. Once you get the liquids added, it's a great time to start trying to deglaze the bottom of that pan. If you got any fond on the bottom of the pan from the sausage, which hopefully you did because that will really enhance the flavor of the gravy. Right now I'm just switching between milk and heavy cream to make sure I have the right ratio of gravy to sausage, because I did still use a pretty good amount of sausage in this. And once it cooks down and thickens up a little bit more, also while the biscuits cook, I ended up adding some more because I wanted to make sure it wasn't too thick. Once we're satisfied with the base of our gravy, it's time to salt and pepper to taste. Make sure you get that really well incorporated, and as I've said before in some other videos, always taste as you cook to know if it's seasoned properly. If you're afraid of getting burned, use a spoon. Not bad, but it needed more black pepper. If you want to add more seasonings to this is the perfect time to do that, but traditionally it's made with really just salt and pepper. This is a really simple recipe. Now that the gravy has been started and is cooking down nicely, I'm going to go ahead and get the biscuits rolled out and shaped. I say rolled out, I don't use a roller in this case. You can, but the recipe I used said not to use a roller, so I was following the instructions. I did go ahead and preheat the oven to 425 degrees, and you'll see me just pressing this out and trying to get about a rectangle shape out of my dough. I am going to fold this over several times, and that's going to help you to develop the layers of the biscuits. So you definitely don't want to skip this step. Again, if you're using your hands like I am, you want to make sure your dough is staying nice and cold. I did end up needing to stick this back in the fridge for a little bit because it was getting a little bit too springy, which means that there was too much gluten being developed. That won't do you any good. It's just going to make your biscuits really tough. Letting it rest after the gluten has developed will kind of allow that gluten to relax, and it won't be quite as bad. And of course, since my oven is already on, I needed to stick it back in the fridge, or else I would risk melting the butter that is mixed in with the dough. And I didn't know, I have a biscuit cutter, but I wasn't sure exactly where I kept it. I moved it recently, and so I just didn't want to find out where it was. So I'm using a glass, but you can use anything round, or honestly you can use any shape that you want. I have made Texas shaped biscuits before, and those turned out really well. So once I find my cookie cutters and biscuit cutters, I'll probably be doing that again. One super important thing to know when you're cutting out your biscuits, no matter what shape you're using, well, I guess this really only applies to round biscuits, you absolutely do not want to twist the glass or your biscuit cutter, because if you twist it, it'll crimp the sides of the biscuits and you won't get a nice rise. Look at how those turned out. I think they were beautiful. The ones I cut out toward the end weren't as beautiful because they didn't have a nice fold like I got on the first set that I cut. But once these are ready and they've cooled, just split them in half and top with the gravy, and you've got biscuits and gravy. I really want to thank you guys for sticking around to the end of this video. I really hope that you liked it and you give it a try. Let me know what you think about it down in the comments, and if you like the video, please consider giving me a thumbs up. Share this video with anybody you think might like biscuits and gravy, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to get notified when I come out with new videos, and I hope to see you around next time. Bye guys!